As you're getting back to your seat, if you would grab your Bible and turn to Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14, and in just a second we're going to look at verse 7, Romans chapter 14 and verse 7. So it's our normal process that we take a book of the Bible and we walk through that book of the Bible. However, this morning we're going to do things a little bit different. We're going to actually give an application of a text we haven't actually looked at yet. We're going to get into Romans 14 next week. But I want to take one verse out of it and apply it to parenting this morning. And the reason why is because of all the things that you do, and this is a terrible confession to make, but of all the things that I do, there's nothing I find more challenging than parenting. It's the greatest joy that in our lives, and we know that, whether you've been a parent for 10 minutes or for 20 years, you know it brings us incredible joy. Nothing brings joy quite like this, but the reality is that you can face tremendous challenges at work, and you can be an expert in your respective field. You can be crushing it at your hobby, but you get home to a 50-pound fourth grader, a fifth grader, and you're like, I don't know what to do here. I mean, it's totally intimidating. And not only that, unlike the things that we normally do in work, the outcomes aren't guaranteed, right? You just don't know what's going to happen. So at some point along the way, you have to decide, okay, what do I really want? And the temptation is to think, well, what I really want is I want kids that are success, right? Be successful. And that's a good ambition, but we know some people that are successful by whatever metric we established in the world, and they're terrible people. Don't point, but you know somebody like that, right? You know somebody like that. We all do. So another thing, we want our kids to be happy. Well, that's true, but man, if parenting teaches you anything, it's that kids do not have literally a brain. Their cognitive processes are not established to know how to make right choices for themselves. Somebody said that's like taking a dog into a pet store and just taking him off a leash and turning him loose and saying, you know what, you make whatever choices you think are best. You come up with the choices you think would be the best outcomes for you. No, they don't understand happiness. It's all thin, and so that can't be a good metric. We often say we want the kids to have our own values. I think that's helpful. We do want them to have our own values, our beliefs. Someone says we want them to have our own virtues. That's their actual character. I think that's getting closer. But what Scripture makes so clear, and I want to encourage you with this morning, is that God has a specific ambition for your children. It's the same ambition it is for us, and it's found in Romans chapter 14. And look at verse 7. Why this verse is here, we'll talk about next week, but it says, "For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's." The ambition is, and this is how Christianity works, all of my life, my existence belongs to God. It's all encompassing. When I die, we know then we go to be with the Lord, so my death is in the Lord's hands. The thing we struggle with in this life is our own living and subduing our own will and submitting it to the Lord. It's what Paul gave us this graphic illustration of earlier in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, where he says, we're like sacrifices, where they would take an actual animal sacrifice and put it on the altar so that animal sacrifice is done. It's been sacrificed. But Paul changes the metaphor a little bit and says, actually, we're living sacrifices. What a weird and strange metaphor. We're still walking around, we're still living in this life, we're still doing our jobs and raising our families, but are doing it in a way where all of our existence is sacrificed to Jesus. To say it in a word, this is what it means to trust and to follow Jesus. And oftentimes as parents, we have a good ambition, and that's to get our kids to pray to receive Christ, to follow in believers' baptism, so that we can pass on the faith that was passed on to us. What's better than that? But what I fear sometimes, and I see this in my own heart, we're more concerned that our kids make a decision than we are than they walk with Jesus. So more important than them deciding at one moment to follow Jesus is to make that decision every day of their lives. In other words, living to honor the Lord. Now, that's hard enough for me. So the big question is this morning, I want us to think about together is, how do you produce children like that? Where all they want is to trust and to follow Jesus with all their hearts. That's God's ambition for them, and with that ambition comes a plan. And so, in the next few minutes, I want to walk through God's plan for your kids. 3 parts here. If you want to take notes, here's the first one. God's plan for your children is that we connect with them. That's the very first thing. And we'll unpack this, but we connect with them. What do you mean we connect with them? Well, by connecting with them obviously means we spend time with them, but it's more than just spending time with them. It's connecting with them in a way that they understand what's important to us. So we're not just engaging them on some kind of macro level. We're connecting them in a certain way that they understand why we make the decisions that we make and how we process things. And so let me use this as an illustration. So a few weeks ago, somebody put this book in my hand, Write It on Their Hearts by Chris Swain. There are lots of good parenting books out there. This is one of the most helpful I've read because it doesn't make you feel horrible as a parent. Some books do that, and that's okay. If you want that, I need some help, right? Could I get an amen out there? I need someone to walk beside me and say, okay, we understand. Here's what's going on. This is really, really simple and practical, and so we purchased about 25 of them, and we'll sell them for real cheap right out here. So if you walk up this way in our resource center, these are there after you. But I'm going to share what I'm about to share, and a lot of what I'm taking from this morning is from his chapter 8 in this book, where he talks about connecting with his kids. And so Chris Swain gave an acronym in there, CARE, C-A-R-E, to talk about connecting with the kids. So let's walk this acronym because I found it really, really helpful. The C, by the first C in CARE, that C stands for compassion. Jesus had a remarkable amount of compassion for people. Jesus looked at a whole city and cried for them because they were lost and aimless. Another time we have Jesus crying because a close friend of his brother has passed away. Jesus is watching her hope and faith really unravel, and it brought him to tears. He was so compassionate. And even when his best friends betrayed him, he restored them. He didn't abandon them. He was so full of compassion. And as a parent, it's natural. We have higher expectations on our children than we do anyone else. I find myself saying to my son, you're better than that. You ever used that one? That's a good one. I actually like that. You're better than that. Because it's trying a way to say, look, I think of you different than you think of yourselves. You're not that kind of person. You're better than that. And while it's a good thing to say, perhaps, it reminds us that we really have these high expectations for our kids. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good. But doesn't it stand to reason that if I have the highest expectations for them that I have of anyone else, I should have the greatest compassion for their failures? The same way that God has really high expectations of me, and his high expectations are not greater, though, than his grace for me. He still loves me. And so it's possible to be disappointed in a child that hasn't met expectations, but still brace that disappointment with a smile on your face because you know that they need the same grace that God is giving to you. Compassion. So the second letter in that acronym for compassion is the C. Now the A is authenticity. What is authenticity? Well, authenticity is something that kids can't articulate, may not be able to pronounce or even spell, but they can sniff it out, right? They know if you're being real or not. Authenticity is not telling our kids everything. That would be a mistake. But it's being honest about everything. Even when we're going through a tough time, even when we don't know, in the right context, if we process that out loud, that's teaching you a little bit of what it's about to be an adult, authenticity. So C-A-R-E, the R stands for relevant. Now there's a good type of relevance and a bad type of relevance. A bad type of relevance is where you try to be like your high schooler or middle schooler. We've all seen the mom or dad who's trying to be the cool mom or dad. When my daughter first got her phone, she entered me in her context as super cool dad. I know there's irony in that. I understand that. She was a little bit of patronizing. I'm fine with that. I know that's kind of what was going on. Because the reality is, if you're a cool person, and some of you are, you don't have to fake it. For the rest of us, if we're trying to be cool, then just by definition, we're not. And someone needs to tell you, if you are, you are. If you're not, you're not. You can't become what you're not. Sorry, it's genetically given. I don't know, can't explain it. It's just the reality. So that's a bad type of relevance, trying to know the kids' music and lingo and all that kind of stuff. It's good to be familiar with it, but you're not in middle school, you're not in high school. But what's a good type of relevance? A good type of relevance is where we understand what our kids are experiencing through a biblical lens. Now, let me give you a strange illustration, but I think this really applies to parenting. Chris Swain used this. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus told a couple of really crazy stories. Here's the first one. A guy has a vineyard. There's an agricultural illustration. Jesus always used common illustrations. And he's going out of town, and so he entrusts the vineyard to a certain group of people. Well, they didn't take care of it. And when the guy would go send servants to go check on it when he was traveling, they would run them off and say, actually, this is ours, not yours. And finally, the guy says, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and send my son because they'll respect him because I can't get back. And they actually beat up the son and send him out. And Jesus is giving an illustration about how the Pharisees, the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, treated the prophets and ultimately Jesus. They ran him off. They didn't understand God's plan. And in the end of the story, the owner of the land comes back and he kills the guys and takes them out. It's a graphic ending, but it's a way of Jesus saying they didn't really understand what was going on. Second story Jesus tells in the same parable is about someone who is actually invited to a wedding feast. I mentioned this last week. That was a really big deal to get invited to a wedding feast. The food was opulent. It was rich. You don't often get to experience something like that, especially not in that culture. But they said, no, we're not interested. And so finally, the man who was throwing the wedding feast sent them a second time and they said, no, we're not interested. Finally, a third time, he said, would you come, and begged them to come in. They said, no, we're not interested. And eventually the guy gets mad and he kills them. He said, that's another graphic illustration. But it was Jesus' way of saying all of the human history, God has been inviting and inviting and inviting and inviting for us to enjoy the gospel message, which is that Jesus died on the cross and rose again. And by God's Son, and God's Son wedding himself to the church, we can have a relationship with him. But by their refusal to understand what God was doing, they became irrelevant. And here's what's very interesting. Listen very carefully. The people that Jesus was calling irrelevant had money, actually lots of money. They had status, and they had all the connections in the world. But right now, I'm guessing you probably can't name one Pharisee or scribe. But we all know who Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are. No formal education, but they believed in Jesus. And Jesus became the lenses by which they saw the whole world. And they became relevant. In fact, Jesus changed the whole world through his relationship with them because they understood life through biblical terms. And our relevance to our kids is not so much how we understand their world. That's not unimportant. But it's more important that we understand the biblical world and we teach them the reality of the truth that surrounds their academics and their athletics and their social network and all those type of things. The E, finally, in this acronym on care for connecting with the kids, stands for engagement. There's two types of engagement we can have with our kids. If we want to engage with them, right? If we don't spend time with them, we're not engaging. If we spend time with them, there's two kinds. And let's just call it shoulder to shoulder and face to face. Shoulder to shoulder, this is where we have a hobby that we enjoy with our son or our daughter. We pursue that thing. Spend time wrestling with them, engaging them, doing whatever's fun with them as they're toddlers and as they grow over. Maybe we're teaching them to hunt or we're teaching them to do something fun. It's shoulder to shoulder. It's an activity that we're doing together. It's a great way to engage with kids. But at some point, we have to move from passive engagement to active engagement, face to face. This is where we're looking in the eye and asking them the hard questions. What do you think about this? Let's talk about your relationship with God. How are you processing things? And you say, well, I don't even know if my kid can answer questions like that. That's okay. We would be equally daunted if someone were to look us in the eye and ask us those questions. You really get nose to nose and knee to knee with somebody and sit down and really talk. It's a scary thing. But even the fact that you're having that conversation communicates that you really believe in this, that there's something real and authentic. And between, frankly, the monotony of what's our American life, of school and sports and blah, 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 it just goes on forever and ever. Driving in the car. It's so good and right for your kids to understand there's something so much more to life than just the pace that we're currently keeping. And if they never hear you say that, even if it's fumbling and awkward, they leave the house thinking, well, this is all there is really, and I'll go try to replicate this life as best as I can, instead of understanding that there's something far, far deeper than that. Now, let me encourage you with something. Of all that Jesus said, we only have about 30,000 words. That's a rough estimate, but recorded in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John record about 30,000 words of Jesus. That's less than the number of words we speak in a week. Of all the days we have of Jesus, there's only 52 days that are recorded in the life of Jesus. You take all the ones that are duplicates in the four Gospels and put together, roughly about 50 plus days of the life of Jesus. So how did someone actually change the course of history? It doesn't matter what you call it. We divide time by BC and AD, by the life of Christ. Call it common era or not, it doesn't matter. Still, Christ is the dividing mark of all of human history. How did he have such impact? It's by spending time with those disciples. All of the things that were unwritten about Jesus had such a profound effect on them that they changed all of history. And so Jesus' strategy to change the world is our strategy to change our own kids, connecting with them. Chris Swain said this, I think was really good. There are moments in the life of our kids that we want to capture forever. Have you ever had one of those? It's a great smile or a great moment, or a kid has this euphoric discovery about life or something like this. I'm trying not to use illustrations about my own kids, although several are coming to mind right now. We just have these moments and you just want to stop. And our kids, if they have a disease, it's going to be being over-photographed. Really, they're going to die of overexposure to camera photography. Every moment of their life is photo. I want to stop and photograph this moment because I just want to preserve this. And I understand the instinct. But Chris says sometimes we confuse connecting with a moment to connecting with a child. Child will forget the moment. And you will too. So the most significant moments to me to parenting are probably blurry memories to my kids, but there was a connection between us that transcended, was bigger than the actual moment. So God's plan is connecting. That was his plan to change the world through his son, Jesus. Here's the second part of God's plan, is that we are teaching our kids, connecting with our kids and teaching our kids. You may be familiar with Deuteronomy chapter 6. If not, if you could turn to it briefly, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. The significance of this passage is that God is teaching his people how to live in this new promised land. In other words, he's creating a social ethic, if you will, by which they would live. That's how sociologists would say it. Here are the ground rules for your new occupation in your new land. Deuteronomy 6:4, but it's much deeper than this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. In verse 7, this is important. You shall teach them diligently to your children. So, and we just stop there. That tells us really the first aspect of this idea of teaching. There's something formal about it. Now, I've seen this done in so many ways. And so let me just encourage you, because I've known people that were so good at this. They had a mapped out plan for what they were going to teach their kids, and they're going to memorize these verses. And man, if you're around somebody like that, it can easily be intimidated. Man, I can't ever do what they did. But can I tell you the best plans? The best plans for talking about the Bible in your homes are the ones you'll keep doing. Could be as simple as reading with them at night. The Jesus Storybook Bible has had a massive impact. I encourage you to get that one if you want to start somewhere else. We also have that, I think a couple of copies of that out in our resource center. I'm just reading through the Bible, but in a way that connects the individual parts with the whole. I've seen some people take a devotional that they're reading and just read it at the breakfast table. Sometimes I'll just take something out of my quiet time, something I've just taught, and read it at the breakfast table. You say, what happens in that moment? And listen very carefully, this is very important. Very little. To my knowledge, no major decisions have been made. No one raised their hand for anything. Just keep eating. That's all that happens. But we're not banking on teaching them for a moment. We're banking them because we have the advantage over anyone else in the world, literally, and that is we have the advantage of time. The law of averages catches up. And it's okay if you have 20 misses if you've got 3,000 chances, right? It's just going to catch up with them. It's going to set a tone in your home. So the enemy will try to tell you you don't have enough Bible knowledge to teach your kids. They'll stump you. They stump me. They'll stump anyone. That doesn't matter. The issue is consistency. What works in the home? I know many people in our church do all kinds of things. They pray after dinner, they have family time after dinner. Some people do it in the morning. It has to change. And what you eventually want is to hand off those formal instruction teaching times, as big or as small as they are, and have that lead into their own time with God. That transition needs to be made. But look at what he says in verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children. That's the formal. Now he talks about the informal. And shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gate. So you're either sitting down or you're not sitting down. You're either in your house or you're out of your house. He basically says that all the time be talking about these principles. And what this gives us the advantage to do and the opportunity to do is to communicate with our own kids how the Bible is changing us. We call the application part of that. And so I don't know if it's helpful or not. Ask me in 30 years and I'll tell you if it worked or not. But it seems to what me helpful, at least to me and to the kids, is to process things out loud. You know, I think the Lord is doing this, but I'm not sure. You say, well, why would you say something that you're not absolutely sure of that the Lord is doing in your life? Well, because that's the way the Christian life is. The Bible is filled with absolutes, but as I walk it day to day, it's filled with questions. God, how do I do this? And so in those informal moments, I'm not necessarily teaching them principles as I am teaching them to watch my life so they can live out the principles because I've given my life to them. What a daunting thing. So it's connecting with kids. That's the first part of God's plan. The second part of God's plan is teaching our kids, both formally and informally. Here's the third part of God's plan, is that we're worshiping with our kids. So we at Immanuel have a plan for your kids. And we haven't formally announced this yet, but starting at the end, or the middle rather, of August, we're going to take all of our from cradle to college, all the way through from preschool, all the way up through our high school seniors. And we're going to go through the whole Bible together. 15 weeks, starting with creation, ending in restoration in the book of Revelation. I'm really, really excited about this because I'm going to be doing the same thing on Sunday mornings. We're all going to sync up together, totally immersion in the story of the Bible. Doesn't that sound awesome? I don't know if you're excited about that. I'm super fired up about that. And the reason why is because for most of my growing up, I had heard all the stories of the Bible. I mean, there was a day we didn't vote on whether you went on Sunday night or Wednesday night. Does anybody else remember that? You just went. It was open, right? You just went. So we did all this. So thousands of hours of immersions. But can I be honest with you? And I don't blame anybody else. When I graduated from high school, I couldn't tell you if David came before or after Noah. And how does the New Testament relate to the Old Testament? I'm talking about basic chronological issues. And so we're going to try to put all that together in a framework so that as we move on from that and hear the stories of the Bible and great stories of faith, we'll know where to connect them historically and how that fits into God's overarching plan. And then we supplement that on Wednesday nights. Our students do small groups with some teaching, and then our preschoolers do music and missions and some teaching, and our kindergarten through fifth graders do something similar. It's a part of missions and in music, and then we do some teaching in there, but the teaching has an accountability aspect. In other words, they have to meet certain things, and at the end, they're rewarded for these type of things. It's not the perfect plan, but it's just a plan. So, this is God's plan for your kids. It's connecting with them, it's teaching with them, and it's worshiping with them. Your walk, your words, and your worship, all those together, that's God's plan. Now, let me encourage you with something. The enemy sometimes will come along and say to you, yeah, it is challenging raising kids. But the enemy will say this, we know it's hard, but the truth of the matter is that the solution is worse than the problem. Because I can't do that. I can't totally commit to a local church, and I can't totally commit to engaging and connecting with my kids spiritually or teaching them the Bible at home. I just can't do that, so the solution is worse than the problem. And that is a lie. It's just a lie. You can do this. Now, let me tell you a story. I'm telling you this story at the risk of being insensitive, but I really don't mean this. I hope you understand the way in which I've communicated. When I was in seminary, graduate school for preachers, I listened to an old cassette tape that was recorded probably sometime in the 1950s, and the pastor told this story, that during that time, parents had a child that was born with Down syndrome. At that time, they had no idea that was coming, and there was a social stigma that probably doesn't totally gone today, but it was really, really worse in that culture, and they were overwhelmed. And they thought, God, why has this happened to us? So that was their emotion. Understandable. And here's what he said to them. He said, I want to give you another way to think about it. Imagine God looked over heaven, and he said, here is a child that's going to need the courage to know how to walk in this culture, need to understand their own value in life, and why they're incredibly valuable and special to God. And then God said, who can I trust this child with? And he gave them to you. The reason why I like that perspective is because that's actually more biblical. Acts 17 says that God determines the times where we live and the actual location where we live. So at least that means the parents that we have. And so there's literally no one more equipped to raise your child than you. That's God's opinion. It's God's opinion because this is his plan. Another lie that we often believe is that we overestimate the strength of one part of God's plan, our walk, our words, our worship, and we underestimate how powerful and strong the whole plan is. We overestimate the power of one aspect, and we underestimate the power of the whole. So, for example, somebody may say, look, I'm going to teach my kids the best I can. I'm going to pour into them. I'm going to spend time with them. I'm going to connect with them. That's wonderful. But that's just one part. Another person says, well, I'm going to just give all my life at the church. I'm going to give all my kids to the church, and I'm not going to teach them at home, and I'm not going to model them, never going to bring this stuff up, but I'm going to outsource that to the church. Well, that's good, but that's not God's plan. That's just one part. Or someone says, well, I'm going to teach them at home, but I'm not going to do the other. Again, that's just one part. And the wisest man who ever lived was teaching on friendship. And here's what he said. He said, it's good to have more than one friend, I'm paraphrasing, because a threefold cord is not easily broken. So you know that phrase. It's out of Ecclesiastes. A threefold cord. Now, in the time that he's writing, lots of modern technologies, if you took a rope and another rope and a third rope and you bound those together, it was incredibly powerful. It wasn't impossible to break. You could take a sword or something, I guess, and break it, but it was very, very hard to break. So listen, moms, dads, listen. And I'm trying to encourage myself with this. Listen. It's a scary world out there, right? Dangerous people and even more dangerous ideologies. Kids have a will. Good kids, good families, walk away. I've seen it happen. But if we teach them in our homes and we model it in our lives and we say, here's the church, I'm going to build my life around this and bring in school and sports as necessary. If we bring those three compelling things to our kids, it is very, very difficult for them to walk away and ignore your connection, your teaching, and your worship. Very, very hard. Not impossible, but very difficult. So our encouragement is bind them to God's word in your teaching, bind them to you in your connecting, and then bind them to the church in the worship. And by giving us this model, do you know what God is doing? He's actually giving us his model. God's a parent. It's a shocking thing, isn't it? Think about it. Jesus said this, his son, I don't do anything unless I see my Father do it. I don't know how he saw his Father doing what he did, but I'm quoting Jesus out of John chapter 5. That's what Jesus said. So the Father was connecting, modeling that, his walk in front of him. Then Jesus said this in the same gospel, I don't say anything unless that which I've heard from my Father. Jesus was God. This is a little bit different to apply to us, understand, because he is God. He shares the same essence and mind with his Father. But Jesus' understanding of his relationship with his Father was that the Father was instructing him. And the result is that Jesus had incredible, incredible love for the Father's house. The two times we saw Jesus get more angry than any time else, one in the beginning of his ministry, one was at the end, where people were not respecting his Father's house. But his love for that worship came from the instruction of the Father and the modeling of the Father in that way. It's a remarkable thing. Maybe the only thing more remarkable than that is that God wants us to be his children. John 1:12 says this, to anyone who believes, he gives them the right to be called the children of God. It's a remarkable thing. No other child has the right to call me father, just 3. I don't have the right to claim you as my parents. But Jesus said, if we could broaden the language a little bit, if you believe the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, that he intercepted God's wrath on your behalf and paid the price for your sins, and put your confidence in him, then the result is that I'll adopt you into my family. And I'll give you a relationship with me that cannot be changed. That's the gospel. So we know we can trust God's plan for parenting because it's his own plan, the way he related to his own son, and it's his plan to bring us into his family.